Picture the single worst place on earth you could stand if the entire football world despised you. Not a hostile locker room, not a post-loss press conference after a 30-point blowout. The absolute worst place, the one that guarantees there is nowhere to hide, nowhere to spin the narrative, and no publicist in the world who can save you, is a live podium at the NFL Combine in Indianapolis, surrounded by hundreds of national reporters, cameras rolling, hot mics everywhere, and a crowd that already knows exactly who you are and exactly what you did. That is where Kevin Stefanski found himself this weekend, and the moment he walked in, the entire building told him exactly what it thought of him. The boos started before he even reached the microphone. They weren't polite, they weren't scattered, they were loud, coordinated, and absolutely merciless. The kind of sound you hear when an entire industry has collectively decided that a man has crossed a line he cannot walk back from. Stefanski stood there, trying to look composed, trying to redirect attention to 40-yard dashes and vertical leap numbers, but the reporters weren't there to talk about draft prospects. They had one target, and they came loaded. Questions about his catastrophic NFLPA grade came flying at him from every direction. His toxic fallout with Michael Penix Jr., the whispers about whether Arthur Blank had essentially forced him into a public apology toward Shedeur Sanders. The press conference didn't just get uncomfortable, it completely collapsed. The crowd in the concourse grew louder, the questions grew sharper, and the situation deteriorated so rapidly that the front office had to physically step in. Matt Ryan had to walk onto that stage and physically guide his own head coach away from the podium before the humiliation went any further. Let that image sink in for just a moment. A sitting NFL head coach, a man who was handed the keys to a brand new franchise just weeks ago, had to be rescued from his own press conference by a former quarterback turned executive because he could not survive the room. That is not a bad day at the office. That is the public unraveling of a man whose reputation has been destroyed by his own decisions. And the story of how Kevin Stefanski arrived at that podium, that broken, that exposed, and that universally despised, is one of the most jaw-dropping tales the NFL has produced in years. Because this wasn't bad luck, this wasn't a media witch hunt, this was cause and effect. Every action he took over an entire season coming back to collect its debt all at once. But here is the part that nobody is fully connecting yet. While Stefanski was being rushed through the back tunnels of that Indianapolis arena, a rumor began circulating among NFL insiders that makes everything even more extraordinary. Reports suggest that the situation surrounding his return flight back to Georgia had people inside the league genuinely stunned. We'll get to that, but first, you need to understand the full picture, because the Indianapolis collapse was just the latest chapter of a story that began long before this weekend. Before we talk about what Stefanski did, we need to talk about what he is currently trying to make everyone forget he did. Right now, Kevin Stefanski is in the middle of one of the most aggressive image rehabilitation campaigns this league has seen from a recently fired head coach. He has been making the rounds. Podcast appearances, carefully placed media quotes, friendly interviews designed to soften the edges of a legacy that is currently in free fall. And at the center of this carefully constructed PR offensive is one specific claim that he keeps repeating, that he loved coaching Shedeur Sanders, that Shedeur has, in his own words, the right makeup for this game and is wired up exactly the right way to be a superstar in this league. He loved coaching him. He believes in him. Shedeur is wired up the right way. These are the words of a man who spent an entire regular season treating his starting quarterback like a problem to be managed rather than a talent to be unleashed. These are the words coming from someone whose game planning decisions, play calling tendencies, and in-game choices told a completely different story every single Sunday. The football world has a long memory, and it also has access to game film, and the game film does not say this coach loves his quarterback. The game film says something far more troubling. But the PR tour is relentless because Stefanski understands something very clearly. He is starting over in Atlanta with a franchise that took an enormous risk on him. And if the national narrative continues to be man who sabotaged Shedeur Sanders, his second chance evaporates before it even begins. So, the apology circuit continues. The friendly podcast soundbites keep coming. The carefully worded praise for a player he no longer coaches keeps getting planted in the press. The problem is that nobody is buying it. Fans aren't buying it, the football media isn't buying it, and most critically, the people inside NFL locker rooms, the players, the assistants, the veterans who watched it happen in real time, are not even remotely buying it. Because there is a massive, unbridgeable gap between what a man says in a podcast studio and what the evidence on the field clearly shows. And in Stefanski's case, that gap is wide enough to drive a freight train through. There are coaching decisions that lose games, and then there are coaching decisions that reveal character. The moment that defined Kevin Stefanski's tenure with the Cleveland Browns, the single play call that crystallized everything wrong with how he managed Shedeur Sanders, happened in one of the most critical possessions of the entire 2025 season. The stakes were as high as they get. The team needed 2 points to keep the season alive. The offense lined up, and every single person watching that broadcast, from the commentators in the booth to the fans screaming at their televisions, expected Shedeur Sanders to be the one executing that play. Instead, Stefanski pulled him. In the most important moment of that entire possession, the exact situation where a head coach is supposed to demonstrate his belief in his quarterback, Stefanski made a decision that did not just cost points, it sent a message. It told Shedeur, it told the offensive lineman blocking for him. It told the wide receivers running his routes. It told every single person in that locker room that the head coach did not trust his quarterback when the game was on the line. You can dress that decision up in all the football terminology you want. You can call it a personnel package or a situational adjustment. But coaches, players, and analysts across the league all saw it for exactly what it was: a public vote of no confidence delivered at the worst possible moment. That is not how you build a franchise quarterback. That is how you break one. What made it even more damaging was the timing. Shedeur Sanders entered the 2025 season as one of the most discussed and scrutinized young quarterbacks the league had seen in years. The spotlight on him was already intense. The pressure was already immense. A head coach in that situation has one primary job above everything else: protect your investment, build his confidence, give him every possible opportunity to succeed, and when the moment comes, let him play. Stefanski did the opposite. He engineered situations that consistently placed Shedeur in uncomfortable positions, called plays that seemed designed more to expose limitations than to capitalize on strengths, and then, when the entire season came down to a single 2-point play, chose someone else. The fallout inside the locker room was immediate and severe. When a coach loses a quarterback, he loses the locker room. It is one of the oldest and most reliable rules in professional football. The quarterback is the emotional center of an NFL roster. When players see their signal caller disrespected by the coaching staff, particularly in high-stakes moments broadcast to the entire country, the fractures form fast and they spread wide. By the time the Browns facility became the toxic environment that everyone inside it was describing to reporters, the seeds had been planted months earlier on that field, on that 2-point conversion, when Stefanski made his choice. The tape doesn't have a PR department. It doesn't get to do podcast interviews. It just sits there, permanent and uneditable, telling the truth. There is a specific detail buried inside Kevin Stefanski's recent media appearances that the football world has not fully processed yet, and once you understand the full weight of it, it reframes everything about how badly this situation deteriorated. NFL coaches get fired on Monday. It is one of the most consistent rituals in professional sports. The season ends, the owner evaluates, and by the following morning, the head coach is clearing out his office. It is so reliably Monday that the entire league has a name for it: Black Monday. It is built into the culture, the contracts, and the expectations of every head coach in the business. Even the most dysfunctional franchises, the ones mired in years of chaos and losing, almost universally wait for the final whistle of Week 18 before they pull the trigger. Jimmy Haslam did not wait. Stefanski himself confirmed the timeline on a recent podcast appearance, and the detail is staggering. He was not fired on Black Monday. He was not even fired after the final game of the regular season. He was fired on a Thursday, 3 full days before the Cleveland Browns were scheduled to play their season finale in Cincinnati. Let that context land properly. The owner of a multi-billion-dollar franchise, a man whose entire financial investment is tied to what happens on that football field, made the calculated decision that it was better for his organization to play the final game of the season without a permanent head coach than to allow Kevin Stefanski to lead that team for 4 more days. Think about what that says. When owners fire coaches mid-week before the final game, it is not a business decision in the traditional sense. There is no competitive advantage to it. You are not improving your draft position. You are not sending a message to free agents. You are making a statement, a raw, urgent, deeply personal statement that the situation inside your building has become so damaging, so corrosive, so fundamentally harmful to your players and your organization that you cannot stomach even 1 more week of it. Jimmy Haslam looked at his locker room, looked at his young quarterback, evaluated the psychological wreckage piling up around both of them, and decided the most responsible thing he could do was end it immediately. Not after the game, not on Monday, Thursday. Stefanski talked about this publicly with what appeared to be an attempt at detached professionalism, framing it as simply how the business works, acknowledging the timing without fully confronting what it meant. But the football community heard exactly what that Thursday firing represented. It was an emergency evacuation. It was an owner choosing the long-term health of his franchise over the short-term optics of continuity. And it was perhaps the loudest possible confirmation that everything the players were saying behind closed doors about the culture Stefanski had built was completely and entirely true. Every year, the NFL Players Association releases their coaching staff grades. For those who don't follow them closely, these grades are arguably the most revealing document in professional football. They are based entirely on anonymous evaluations submitted by the players themselves, the men who spend every single day inside those facilities, who run those practices, who execute those game plans, and who absorb the daily reality of working under these coaching staffs. There is no media spin involved. There is no political maneuvering. It is the most unfiltered, honest assessment a head coach can receive in this league, and it carries the weight of a verdict because it comes from the only people whose opinion truly matters. Kevin Stefanski received a C-, dead last, 32nd out of 32 head coaches in the entire National Football League. To fully appreciate the scale of that failure, consider who he finished below. He finished below coaches who were openly managing tanking rosters, teams that had deliberately stripped talent and were competing for top draft picks rather than wins. He finished below first-year head coaches who arrived with no experience running an NFL sideline, who were still learning the mechanics of in-game management, who were making the kinds of rookie mistakes that every new head coach makes in year 1. He finished below coaches whose teams had lost a combined dozens of games. The men who were running the worst, most hopeless situations in professional football still managed to earn more respect from their players than Kevin Stefanski earned from his. That is not a coaching grade. That is a rejection letter. Compare it to what the top coaches received. Sean McVay sat near the summit of the list, praised by his players in terms that reflected genuine respect, admiration, and trust. The gap between McVay's grade and Stefanski's grade was not a subtle difference in management style or strategic preference. It was the gap between a coach who had built something real with his roster and a coach who had systematically destroyed every relationship inside his building. You do not finish last in an anonymous player vote unless you have committed a sustained series of failures that went far beyond lost games. You finish last when your players no longer believe you have their best interests at heart. You finish last when the locker room has concluded, collectively and decisively, that things will be better the moment you are gone. That C- was not just an indictment of Stefanski's coaching, it was a full, documented, league official confirmation of everything that rumors and reports had been saying for months, and it followed him out the door, across the country, and straight into Indianapolis, where the players, the media, and the football public made very sure he understood that the verdict had already been delivered. The Cleveland chapter is damaging enough on its own, but there is a layer to the Stefanski story that directly impacts Atlanta, a situation involving the Falcons' current starting quarterback that raises serious questions about whether Stefanski learned anything at all from what happened in Cleveland. The fallout with Michael Penix Jr. is something the Atlanta organization has been trying to manage carefully since reports first began surfacing. Penix, the second-year quarterback who arrived with enormous expectations after the Falcons' controversial decision to select him in the first round, had his own complicated path through the 2024 season. The dynamics inside that Atlanta building, the relationship between the quarterback, the coaching staff, and the front office, were described by multiple sources close to the situation as deeply strained. And the specific details that have circulated about how those relationships fractured paint a picture that should feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who watched what happened in Cleveland. Rumors suggest that Penix was placed in a developmental situation that felt more restrictive than constructive. Reports claim the communication between the quarterback and key members of the coaching staff broke down in ways that affected preparation and performance. Multiple sources indicated that the internal environment around the quarterback position was far more tense than the official organizational messaging suggested. Now, it is critical to frame all of this appropriately. These are reports and claims circulating among insiders, not officially documented facts. But the pattern they describe aligns so precisely with the documented Shedeur Sanders situation that it is impossible to dismiss without serious examination. Here is the question that every Atlanta fan and every Falcons executive needs to be asking right now. If Stefanski's first act as the new head coach is to inherit a wounded relationship with a starting quarterback who already has reason to be skeptical of the coaching staff, and if his track record with the previous franchise quarterback is the worst documented case of its kind in recent memory, what exactly is the plan? What changes? What is different this time?
The people who hired him clearly believed the Cleveland situation was situational. They believed it was the wrong fit at the wrong time and that a fresh start in Atlanta will reveal a different coach. That may be true. It is absolutely possible that Stefanski reflects, adapts, and approaches Michael Penix Jr. with a completely different philosophy. It is possible. But the burden of proof is entirely on him now, and the skepticism surrounding him is not irrational or unfair. It is earned, documented, and sitting right there on the public record for anyone to read. The Atlanta Falcons have one of the most culturally distinctive locker rooms in the NFC. It is a roster built on personality, confidence, and a kind of collective identity that does not tolerate inauthenticity. Players in that building have spoken openly over the years about how important the culture feels to them, how the locker room dynamic, the relationships, and the sense of mutual respect between coaches and players are non-negotiable elements of their environment. You can arrive in Atlanta with an impressive resume and a sharp suit and a carefully rehearsed speech about your offensive philosophy, but if the players in that building sense that you are performing rather than leading, they will see through it almost immediately. Stefanski is arriving with the lowest player approval rating in professional football stamped on his professional profile. He is walking into a building where at least some of the players are already aware of what happened in Cleveland, because the entire league is aware of what happened in Cleveland. He is inheriting a quarterback situation that already has its own complications, and he is doing all of this while simultaneously attempting to convince the public through podcast interviews and carefully crafted media appearances that he is a different coach than the one who just received a C- from his own roster. The margin for error is essentially zero. NFL locker rooms can be extraordinarily forgiving when a coach comes in humble, self-aware, and genuinely committed to the players in front of him. Some of the most successful coaching turnarounds in league history have involved coaches who arrived with damaged reputations and rebuilt them through consistency, honesty, and a genuine investment in their players as human beings first and athletes second. That path exists for Stefanski if he wants to take it. But if he reverts to the controlling tendencies, if he makes another play call that tells his quarterback the locker room sees through it before the press conference is even over, if the ghost of Cleveland shows up in Atlanta and starts whispering the same patterns into his decision-making, that locker room will not give him the same slow boil it took in Cleveland. It will be faster, louder, and far more public, because everyone is watching this time. Every single coordinator decision, every quarterback touch percentage, every late-game personnel choice will be filtered through the lens of what he did to Shedeur Sanders. He has no anonymity left. The entire football world has his number. Now we get to the piece of this story that began circulating through Indianapolis almost the moment Stefanski was rushed off that stage. Sources inside the league, and it is important to frame this clearly as insider chatter and unverified reporting rather than confirmed fact, began suggesting that the situation surrounding Stefanski's return to Georgia following the Combine was far more complicated than a simple flight home. Rumors circulating among NFL insiders claim that the atmosphere between Stefanski and the Falcons front office following the Combine disaster was notably frosty. Multiple people describe the energy between the coaching staff contingent and the organizational brass as deeply uncomfortable. The specific claim that gained traction, again, this is being reported as rumor and speculation among league sources, not as confirmed reporting, is that Arthur Blank's reaction to the Combine catastrophe was severe enough to create real tension around the logistics of the trip back. The suggestion being made in these circles is that Blank, a man known for his intense focus on organizational reputation and public image, was furious at the scale of the embarrassment, and that the conversations happening in the background between him, his front office staff, and the people in Stefanski's camp reflected a much larger conflict than any of the official organizational statements have acknowledged. Whether or not the most dramatic version of these rumors is accurate, the fact that they are circulating at all and circulating widely enough to reach multiple independent sources covering the Combine is itself a story. It speaks to how fragile the relationship between Stefanski and the Falcons organization may already be, just weeks into what was supposed to be a fresh start. It suggests that the Indianapolis disaster was not a minor speed bump that everyone internally shrugged off. It landed hard, it landed publicly, and according to the people talking about it, it landed in ways that have real implications for how this coaching tenure is going to unfold. Keep an eye on this, because if the front office communication between Blank and Stefanski is already this strained this early, the road ahead is going to be significantly more turbulent than either party is currently willing to admit publicly. Here is the part of the Stefanski story that gets genuinely lost in all the outrage and the boos and the NFLPA grades and the press conference disasters. Shedeur Sanders survived him. Think about that for a moment, because it is actually remarkable. A rookie quarterback in his first NFL season was systematically placed in uncomfortable situations, had his confidence publicly undermined in critical moments, operated inside a culture that the players themselves rated as the worst in the entire league, and emerged from all of it with his talent intact, his reputation clean, and the organization that employed his former coach choosing to build around him rather than the man who coached him. The Cleveland Browns looked at the wreckage of the 2025 season and made a very clear organizational statement. The problem was never the quarterback. That is the ultimate verdict on Kevin Stefanski's Cleveland tenure, and it is more damning than any grade or any booing crowd could ever be. When an NFL franchise publicly chooses to retain a rookie quarterback over the head coach who coached him, it is not just a personnel decision, it is an institutional acknowledgement that everything the critics were saying was correct. It is the organization saying, in the clearest possible terms, we believe in this player, and we did not believe in that coach. Stefanski can do the podcast circuit indefinitely. He can generate sympathetic narratives about fresh starts and lessons learned. He can arrive in Atlanta with the most carefully
engineered public image his team can construct. But none of that changes what happened in Cleveland. None of that erases the game tape. None of it undoes the C- or the Thursday firing, or the two-point conversion play call that told an entire locker room exactly what its head coach thought of its quarterback. The boos in Indianapolis were not random. They were not the work of a few disgruntled fans who happened to find their way into the combine. They were the sound of an entire football community, players, coaches, executives, media, and fans, delivering a collective assessment of a man who had the opportunity to build something special and chose to tear it down instead. That sound followed him off the stage, through the tunnel, and all the way back to Atlanta. The question now is whether Atlanta ends up being a redemption story or a second act of the same disaster. The Falcons rolled the dice on a coach the rest of the league had already evaluated and found lacking. Michael Penix Jr. is watching every move. The locker room is taking notes from day one, and the entire football world, with fresh memories of Indianapolis still ringing in their ears, is waiting to see whether Kevin Stefanski is capable of becoming something different than the last year of evidence suggests he is. Some coaches find themselves in a situation that breaks them, absorb the lessons of that failure, and come back fundamentally changed. It happens. This league has seen remarkable second acts from coaches who arrived at their second job with nothing but humility and a genuine commitment to doing things differently. But this league has also seen coaches who carry their worst instincts with them from city to city, from locker room to locker room, unable or unwilling to confront the patterns that destroyed them the first time. The Indianapolis crowd clearly believes they already know which category Stefanski belongs to. The Atlanta Falcons are betting everything on the opposite conclusion. We will find out soon enough who is right. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Is Kevin Stefanski walking into Atlanta with a genuine chance at redemption, or is the Falcons locker room about to find out the hard way exactly what Cleveland already knows? And if you want to stay ahead of every major story developing across the league this offseason, subscribe and hit that bell, because this Stefanski situation is far from over, and the next chapter is going to be something the entire NFL world will be talking about.